Bethany that very day. That very day, the people of the Jews heard he was there. Much people of the Jews, therefore, knew that he was there, and they came not only for Jesus' sake, but that they might see Lazarus also, whom he had raised from the dead. But the chief priests consulted that they might put Lazarus also to death, because that by reason of him many of the Jews went away and believed on Jesus. So now you have the chief priests and the Jews coming to Bethany because Jesus and Lazarus are there. And the chief priest is involved, who on the Sabbath is required to be in the temple, and yet he's traveling to Bethany here to go see Jesus and Lazarus and plot their death. My question is simple. Could any of that have happened on a Sabbath day? The simple answer is no. There's certainly no way that the chief priest could have left Jerusalem on the Sabbath. There's much too much to do. Now, my simple point is this. If it's true that those events could not happen on the Sabbath day, then verse 12, which says, on the next day, much people that were come to the feast, when they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, took branches of palm trees and went forth to meet him and cried, Hosanna, blessed is the King of Israel that comes in the name of the Lord. That couldn't have happened on a Sunday because the previous day's events couldn't have happened on a Sabbath. And so Jesus did not die on a Friday because he himself went around saying a wicked, adulterous generation requires a sign to believe, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. And even as Jonah was in the belly of the whale 3 days and 3 nights, so will the Son of Man be in the belly of the earth 3 days, 3 nights. Now we have to assume that the King of creation, who spoke and made everything, could count to 3. And that he knew what a day was, and that he knew what a night was. And that he could count 3 days, and that he could count 3 nights. And even if you're going to go with the popular argument that any part of a Jewish day constitutes a day, and therefore part of Friday, all of Saturday, and part of Sunday is somehow 3 days, there's still no way to get 3 nights in there, is there, David? I see David going, no nights. Yeah, you can't get 3 nights in there. So then, wouldn't Jesus, if he was being accurate, have said 3 days and 2 nights? He had to have known how long he was going to be in the grave. He was in the grave 72 actual hours. He was in the grave from Wednesday night to Thursday night to Friday night to Saturday night, and by the time the women came Sunday morning, the grave was already empty. They did not come at sunup and see him rise. They came at sunup, the stone was rolled back, and the angel said, he's gone. Why are you looking for the living among the dead? He was already gone by Sunday morning. So next week, on Sunday morning, don't get up at sunrise. Sleep late. Come here. Because we won't be getting up. We won't be getting up to worship the sun rising. Because Jesus did not get up at sunup. But again, these are the traditions that people love so much that even if you point it out to them in the Scripture. Now, you can go to our website, go to the Q&A section. You'll find a Q&A called the Passion Week chart. And there's a full chart of the 3 days and 3 nights that Jesus was in the grave, along with all the scriptural evidence of the things that took place each of those 3 days. And once you see it, it's very clear and very obvious.
And
so
you got to point out how he fulfills each of those things.
Well, I wasn't going to get into that, but as long as you've brought it up. See, here's the deal.
Way to go. Is this all introduction?
This is all introduction. None of this counts against my time. And worse for you, I have nowhere to be today. So, see, the point is this. In the Old Testament, there were 2 sets of feasts, the spring feast and the fall feast. And for 1,400 years, all of Israel kept those feasts. And they kept them exactly according to a particular calendar. The first of these spring feasts was the Passover. And it always happened on the 14th of the month of Nisan. Now, on a Jewish calendar, the day is reckoned from sundown to sundown. It's not reckoned from midnight to midnight the way our solar calendars work. So on a Jewish lunar calendar, Middle Eastern lunar calendar, it's from sundown to sundown, which means that sundown of what would be considered the 13th is the beginning of Sabbath. That's now the 14th day of Nisan. Does that make sense? So they would watch the moon. They would figure out their months off the lunar calendar by watching the moon. And as soon as a couple of witnesses verified that the beginning of the next lunar cycle had begun, where they saw the first sliver of light. That would be the beginning of the month. The full moon would happen on the 14th. On the full moon, on the 14th, that would be the day of the Passover. Now, the next day after Passover was the first day of a week-long feast called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And the first day and the last day of that feast were called high days and Sabbaths. And it didn't matter what day of the week they fell on, they were still Sabbaths. And they were high Sabbaths. You could do no servile work on those days. High Sabbaths. And it didn't matter if it started on a Tuesday and went to a Tuesday. It didn't matter if it started on a Thursday and went to a Thursday. Whatever day the 14th of Nisan fell on, the next day was the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and it was a high day, a Sabbath. That's really important because in the Gospel of John, he's very specific to tell us that the reason they had to get Jesus' body down off the cross was that the next day was a high day. That's the Sabbath that they had to get him off the cross for. That's why people read it and see, well, Sabbath, and they think, well, that's always a Saturday. So they say, well, then Jesus died on a Friday, had to be off the cross by Friday night because Saturday was beginning. Doesn't matter. Where the high day is concerned, it could be any day of the week. You following that? Now, in the midst of that week-long Feast of Unleavened Bread, there was going to be a first day of the week somewhere in there. If you start on a Tuesday and go to a Tuesday, start on a Thursday, go to a Thursday, start on a Friday, go to a Friday, somewhere in that week there's going to be a first day of the week. And so for 1,400 years during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, whatever day that first day of the week fell on, whether that was 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days into the week, whatever day it fell on was the Feast of First Fruit. Always. And that's why the Gospels are very clear to tell us that during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Jesus rose on the first day of the week. That's why they all agree on that. That date they agree on. First day of the week, that's the day Jesus got up out of the tomb, and so Paul calls him the first fruit of the resurrection. Which means that if Jesus kept the Passover the night before, because remember, Passover, the 14th of Nisan, starts at sundown. He was able to keep the Passover meal with his apostles and was able to change the focus of it and say, for 1,400 years, you've been remembering your deliverance from Egypt. Now, when you do this, remember me. He didn't say stop doing it. He said keep the Passover, but now remember me. And he changed the focus to himself. The next day, 3 o'clock, as he's dying, it's still Passover. He's still the Passover lamb, still bearing the sins of his people. So the typology of the Passover is perfectly fulfilled in the death of Christ. But the reason that Joseph of Arimathea had to hurry up and get Jesus' body off the cross and get him into a tomb is that night was coming. The evening was coming, and the next day was a high day. So they had to hurry quickly and get him into a tomb, so they went to the closest tomb, which was Joseph of Arimathea's empty tomb. So they hurry and they get him into the tomb because sundown that night is a high day. Doesn't matter what day of the week it is, it's a high day. Well, if you follow the 72-hour, 3-day, 3-night plan, that puts Jesus Tuesday night eating the Passover meal. Wednesday afternoon, he's on the cross. Wednesday night, he's in the tomb, which is the beginning of Thursday. He's in the tomb 72 hours. That takes you to Saturday night. And if he's out of the tomb by sunrise, then it's true what all of the gospel writers write, that when they came to the tomb Sunday morning, it was empty. He has risen 72 actual hours. I argue that the Bible does know what it's talking about, and that Jesus did fulfill the Passover, that he did take God's wrath as our Passover lamb, that he was the unleavened bread from heaven that was in the tomb for those 3 days, 3 nights, that he was the first fruit of the resurrection coming up out of the grave, and 50 days later, exactly on time, Peter preached the sermon that brought the church into existence on Pentecost, fulfilling that feast perfectly. Now, you can't do that if you say he died on a Friday and got up on a Sunday. And yet, if you just let the Bible speak, Jesus perfectly fulfills 1,400 years of typology that the Israelites had been carrying around with them, having no idea what it all pointed to. You see all that? So I would rather argue for the text. I'd rather say, no, the Bible's right, and we need to be willing to pull the rug out from under all those traditions and just let the Bible guide and steer our thinking on these subjects. So Palm Sunday, why don't we have palms scattered around? Why isn't everybody going home with a palm branch today? Because it didn't happen on a Sunday. And if he died on a Wednesday and it was 5 days before that, then you have no problem with any of the events that you read in the text. All right?